Night trucks.
Night trucks, road roller trucks,
Oh,
and
boy.
guest trucks.
Yes, trucks! Who's in the house?
Hi, I am Tumblr user Cattle Tyrants.
This is Taylor.
I'm Taylor.
I
You
read.
can call me Taylor.
Do you not want to be called Taylor? We can bleep that
Taylor's
out.
fine.
All right.
Alright. We're here today because Taylor has an almost encyclopedic knowledge of mountain disasters.
People with encyclopedic knowledge of things are
Always welcome in the cab.
Yeah.
And so what's going to happen today is that Taylor's going to run us through like all of the things that we shouldn't do if we want to climb a very high mountain.
And the list is long.
And the
there are a
things
lot
that
of things.
will probably happen to us anyway if we do.
This information might save a life.
The
so
moral of
take
the
notes.
story is you probably shouldn't climb very high
If
mountains.
you haven't already been climbing very high mountains, it's probably not the sport for you.
Wow, how does anyone get started climbing very high mountains in that case?
It's a self-selecting little group. Their parents probably did.
The story I always
you know.
hear is that like people look at the mountain and go, I need to climb that. I need to. That's the cliche, right?
It is
Yeah.
the cliche.
Because
and,
it's there.
and often the people that are that do end up mountain climbing do live near mountains when they're young. Otherwise, you're called a flatlander and your odds are bad.
You need to have like grown up with the mountain, speaking the mountain's language.
Those who didn't grow up by the mountain are too likely to be intimidated by the mountain.
Others just not prepared for the
They
mountain.
might be smarter.
Might be.
Yeah.
haven't spent a lifetime being brainwashed by a mountain.
It's possible, or at least the draw doesn't overcome their risk aversion when they read about how dangerous climbing mountains is. That might be.
So you, I take it, have climbed mountains.
I have no.
Ah.
Well, I have climbed some mountains, but always in summer, and like crampons and an ice axe were not involved, and that's sort of the extent of my own mountaineering experience. It's nil.
Okay, so what's your approach to this? What got you into this? Was it your experience?
I'm going to say fascination with death.
When I was 9, I stole my dad's copy of Into Thin Air and then read it over like a series of like 3 or 4 evenings as an elementary schooler.
Nice.
And it is a terrifying book. And so that kicked off all of this.
So straightforward childhood book trauma,
Yeah,
which created a repeating pattern of wanting to be terrified in a similar way
exactly.
over and over. It's an interesting way to go. Can you remind any of yours who are not familiar with
Right.
what happens Into Thin Air?
Right. So Into Thin Air is a book by John Krakauer, and it was a book basically underwritten by Outside Online. But they didn't know they were underwriting a book. They knew they were underwriting a magazine article. And so they sent John Krakauer as a journalist on an expedition to Mount Everest in 1996. And it just so happened that expedition ended up being caught up in what was, to that point, the most fatal mountaineering disaster on Mount Everest. 11 people died. And over the course of 2 days in May 1996, and so John Krakauer is a very good writer who happened to be on that expedition. And ever since then, there have been a series of books by different people that were on the mountain, and so you kind of get a neat like Rashomon effect between everyone's different
On the same
experience.
expedition?
Yeah,
Oh,
or
okay.
like different teams, so different expeditions, but on the mountain at the same
Yeah.
time.
Did they like encounter each other's left behind corpses?
Yes.
Oh my god.
Very, very often.
You can like point specifically to who that was. I
Right,
guess?
well, 'cause
it's a
you-
relatively small club of people who've been up there.
It is a small club, and also like your body doesn't decay when it's that cold
Yeah.
and that high. So there's the body of George Mallory, who was one of the first people to attempt Mount Everest. He was an Englishman who was climbing, I think it was in 1923. They found his body in 1999, sort of mummified, had a hole in it because crows got in him. But he's still there.
The crows are okay up there, huh?
Oh, they're big. They call them Goraks. They're like big ravens.
Follow-up question. Are there any unknown bodies up there?
Yeah, there are, especially, they're not all found, but most of them have been identified, but there are definitely some, like, you can find, what happens is that if you die on a mountain and you're not, like, on a snowfield where you stay put, you're most likely going to have fallen and tumbled, and when you fall, almost always your feet and shoes fly off, and you end up in lots of pieces, and the longer it is, you can just be skeletal remains, and so
Whoa.
there are definitely, unidentified skeletal remains where we're like, we know this many people died, but we don't know who this is.
Right. Wow.
And the bodies just stay up there right? Because it's uneconomical and dangerous to retrieve
Right.
them.
For the most part, bodies don't stay up there. There is a common burial is just to, if you can, when the body is still sort of fresh and recent, you stick the poor person into a crevasse, which is like a big crack in the ice, and like let them go down.
Just feed them to the mountain's hungry mouth.
Yeah, essentially, because then they get eventually spit out in the glacier moraine.
Oh my god.
But there has been recently efforts to remove bodies from the mountain, because it's gotten a lot of press in large part.
It gets less appealing to climb the mountain when it's mostly bodies up there, I suppose.
Right. And
Corpse riddled is not a look that you want in your
Yeah.
tourist brochure.
there's a section of the mountain called the Rainbow Valley, which my understanding is that that's on the north side, kind of high up near the summit, but it's at a place where, because of the altitude, like the human body's incapable of surviving at high altitudes, and so the higher you get, the better. They call it the death zone because, like, literally it's where you die. Like, that's the technical term for it.
Excellent.
And so over there, it's because all of everyone's colored parkas and like colored snowsuits. They wear these like big down snowsuits to climb, and it's called the Rainbow Valley because of the different assortment of colors of everyone's clothes.
As they're strewn about.
Yeah.
That's some gallows humor.
I mean,
Rainbow Valley. That's where all the
I
bodies
imagine
are.
that you have to be pretty deathy in the first place to want to attempt this kind of thing.
I think it's the opposite, actually. The people who climb tend to be the people who think that death can't happen to them, even despite all of their friends many of their friends having died. Like, if you've been climbing for a long time at a high level, like doing these very high mountains, almost always you'll have a friend who died doing something similar. But these people tend to have like an idea that it can't happen to them because they're they're smarter or they're more cautious. Stuff like that. Luckier.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
What a culture.
It is. It's a really performative sports culture. It's kind of, and it's really literary too. I think more than most sports, there's a huge canon of mountaineering literature.
The entire thing is like a poetic kind of pursuit.
Yeah, and there's a history of writing books about your experience climbing.
Yeah.
Mostly because historically it's been an upper middle class kind of sport. Really rich people didn't do it, and really poor people couldn't afford to take the time off work or go do it either, because it was sort of an expensive, time-consuming, but also like high value, like a high prestige sport. But people would write books about their adventures in climbing, and this has started a long time ago and continues to this day.
It's like an explorer's memoir.
I guess you can't really take a full documentary crew up there very easily.
No, they've
No.
done that, but it's hard. You basically have to be a climber and then a videographer. There's not that many people that
Yeah,
can
you
do
can't
both.
you can't just bring a videographer along. And
Yeah. But that same 1996 disaster that Krakauer wrote about, where all those people died, at the same time, a man named David Brashears was there with an IMAX crew filming IMAX. So those are those huge film reels to do like the high definition. They used to show them in those big movie theaters,
You remember those domes?
right?
Yeah.
And so actually they did film that the show he was filming ended up being about the disaster, just because it happened to be that was when they were climbing also.
So we
It's
have
a
very
wild time.
high-res footage.
Some producer was very secretly happy.
Probably. Well, it was. They told them they actually the IMAX people told David Brashears that if they wanted, they understood that their friends had died. Like they were close friends with some of the guides that had died on the mountain, and they were like, if you want to come home, you can. So they actually let them have the choice, but they decided to finish filming.
Right. I mean, they weren't gonna force them to stay under any circumstance, were they?
You never know.
So you said 11 people died.
Yes.
How many of those people were climbers and how many of those people were
And-
guides?
So that's a who dies on a mountain like Mount Everest it can be kind of touchy subject. In 1996, almost I think everyone that died was the Westerner climbing, but many of them were guides. The two head guides, there were two expeditions that were the main, like two that had a lot of Americans, and so they're the best publicized here. But both of those guides died. A man named Scott Fisher and a New Zealander named Rob Hall. But they also lost clients but no Sherpas or either like the porters or the climbing
Right.
Sirdars.
Is Sherpas
guide.
like a term that one can use?
I mean, it's the people. It's a complicated term because Sherpa in modern usage, like in America, it just means someone carrying stuff. But what is actually the term that has become accepted for that is high altitude porter. And then Sherpas are actually like an ethnic group of Tibetans that a long time ago migrated over to the Nepal side of the Himalaya and then settled in the Solu Valley and the Khumbu Valley, and Mount Everest is right in there.
And this group just kind of gained a reputation for being helpful for helping
Yeah,
people climb
well,
the mountain.
a lot of there's some really interesting reasons why that is. There's a good book. I wish I could remember what it was called, by an anthropologist who had worked with the Sherpas for a long time, and what she said is that a lot of that had to do with good press from certain expedition leaders, like in the 1920s and 1910s. But some of it also was that the Sherpas traditionally are not vegetarians, but in India, most Hindus are vegetarians, and so when it came to it was mostly British people doing a lot of those expeditions at that time, and it's easier to feed high calorie rations to people who aren't vegetarian.
So it was the fact that they weren't picky about their food
That
made
was
them
definitely part of
desirable
it.
for this job.
But they have a good reputation about climbing, and also they
The British also had this thing where they would make judgments about particular ethnic group specialization for various kinds of military service or clerical service, or across the board. They had records on what every different kind of major family in India was good for.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Also, another part is that I think the Sherpas are historically, the way that they divided up their land, you would end up with a lot of younger sons that didn't have any property inheritance that would have to go out looking for work,
i.e. expendable.
Yeah,
right.
Essentially. And I think that some of that continues to this day with the way that property is transferred in these villages.
Interesting. So, but the relationship between the folks and the climbers is it's a lot of money coming in.
It's
and a lot of lives being risked for the money that's coming in.
Right.
And also just white people corpses littering this.
Right. Well, and so white people are definite, Westerners, not even just white people, because in 1996 there were people from high altitude parts of India that died. It was a bad storm that people were caught up in. But what does happen is that, okay, I actually lost the question.
I don't think I actually got around to asking one.
Okay, my bad. I had something to say, but I forget.
I was talking about how they feel about white people corpses all over their mountain.
Oh, right.
And other non-native or non-local corpses.
Right. Well, so the deal is that Mount Everest, which is not that, believe it or not, that's not the local term.
Oh, really?
Mountain. I mean, shocker there. In Nepal, I think it's called Sagarmatha, and then in Tibet, and so also in the Sherpas call it Chomolungma. I'm probably butchering these, but anyway, it is supposed to be the most generous of, there's the legend about this mountain has a particular god on it, and that god wishes prosperity for people. And so if you're going to commercialize a mountain, there is a kind of a feeling that it should be this one, because the other ones are meaner and would take offense more.
Right, and this one, who is nice, already kills a lot of people.
Right. But definitely it is obviously it's a gray area, because while it's a holy place and obviously you shouldn't be defiling it with a bunch of dead people, you got to make a living, and so it's
right.
there is a bit of a thing there. It's a little gray area, but definitely they've closed Mount Everest for a few times in the recent years, and that's because a lot of the people dying were not Westerners. The most dangerous part of the mountain is on the southeast side, at least, which is the Nepal side. The most dangerous part of the mountain is what is called the Khumbu Icefall, which is it's right in between base camp and Camp 1. And so there you go to Camp 4 and then go up to the summit. So you're in the very kind of bottom, But the ice fall is a bunch of crazy ice towers that will collapse with no notice. And so also the people that travel through the ice fall the most are the porters and Sherpas transferring all of this equipment to the higher camps. So
Right.
they're statistically more likely to be caught in an accident because they're in the most dangerous part of the mountain most often.
Why do they carry the stuff that way?
They get paid.
Why is there no better way to do it?
Yeah, there's not. Because like Mount Everest is 29,000 something feet tall, and once you get to be at that kind of altitude, base camp's at 18,000 feet.
Yeah.
So once you get to that high of an altitude, it's very difficult for a helicopter or something to get lift. And so everything happened like technically one time a helicopter touched a thing on the top, but this is all very recent, and you can't bank on a helicopter being able to fly up there. So it is almost all people walking.
And there's no better way to walk than through the bit with the collapsing ice.
Right. Yeah. There's no way around it.
Man.
Yeah. It's nature's fun, Ninja Warrior obstacle course.
It's almost like people aren't supposed to go there.
Yes, like that is being broadcast. You can go there, but through
But
the
why?
collapsing ice tower area. Are you
to
sure
what?
you want to do that? Like, and it gets worse up ahead. Like, there is the death zone, for example,
Yes.
where you die.
There's the part where you can't breathe.
Yep.
Yep. And spoiler alert: all that's there is more ice and more rocks. That's been found time and time again. Nothing fun up top.
So I think at the beginning of this, we promised the audience a list of ways to not die. So do you?
I think these are more a list of ways to die.
totally.
That you should try to
Just
avoid.
I'm
take the
wondering-
end first.
Yeah.
Do you have any either really stupid things people did or seemingly common sense things
Yeah.
people did that turned out to be?
There are some. Some of them are really sad. This one poor guy I think he was just in Camp 2 on Mount Everest. This is a story from 1996, but he had to pee, so he went out of his tent, but he didn't put his crampons on, so he's just out in his little sock booty things, and he slipped down the mountain and died, and was carried back by he was later towed back by Americans who didn't know his name or anything. His compadres went up further.
So thing one, always wear the things.
Yeah. Try
Yeah.
to keep your boots on.
And
ideally.
if you go with people who won't keep on climbing. You just croaked.
Well, I mean that seems to be the general attitude among climbers. Is that
It is and it isn't. It definitely gets there's a lot of bad press. There was a guy, I think in 2006, named David Sharp, who was a British guy who climbed the north side of Mount Everest with a budget company called Asian Trekking.
Budget mountain climbing.
Yeah, so it's like the very cushy expeditions can cost, in 1996 they cost $65,000, like American dollars, so I'm sure it's more now.
Yeah.
But the budget company he went with, I think, cost $7,000 to $12,000 total with all of his equipment and food, like much cheaper. But he had no friends or help, and so he got stuck in a cave where there had been a guy's body from the 1996 disaster. They called him Green Boots, but because his boots were green,
Yeah.
they used him as a landmark because you had to kind of walk over him no matter what. But then David Sharp was in the same little cave and had been caught out at night on the north side, and some people didn't see him, or they thought he was Green Boots, or by the time people noticed that he was hanging out there in a really bad way, there was no way to help him down.
So
he stayed up there and then,
Yeah,
and then got-
stayed up there.
Well, I think his parents, they got him down eventually, or they at least covered him up with rocks. That's the other thing they do.
Cairns.
That's a little rock pile.
Sure.
That's how Captain Picard buried Kirk.
It's dignified then.
Yeah, I mean more dignified than Green Boots.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a thing to be known for.
The thing with Green Boots is that I'm hoping that these pictures were like flip-flopped, but people took a lot of pictures of him and they found their way to the internet, and the disturbing thing is he keeps on being flipped over. Like he's facing one way and then he's facing the other way, and eventually people
What if that's
covered him up
happening
with
while no
rocks,
one's
but, like,
looking?
He got covered up with rocks.
Is the
a few
identity
years
of Green
ago.
Boots a mystery?
It is. He is either one of two people on what was called the Indo-Tibetan Border Police expedition, and so his name is either Dorje Morup or Sawang Paljor, I think, and I probably butchered those names as well. but they were both from northern India, which is a high altitude place as well. So they were just caught up in a really bad storm. Basically, it's sad.
So, tell me about what happens to people's brains up there.
Yeah, so people can't. The bodies of humans can't handle high altitudes or low air pressure situations like you get. So you can either get your cognitive functions decline really badly. There's a great documentary on YouTube showing this. And so basically they had people do like psychology tests, like repeating back a sentence. Like I'd say like, Susie was in the bus yesterday, but now she took the car. That would be a bad sentence, but something like that. Right. And then they would have them repeat back, and they would do it at these different intervals up the mountain. And the higher they got, the stupider they became. And so what this ends up being is you get all of these stories in these mountaineering books about like when you're really high up in the death zone, ready to go on your summit bid, we just call like the day that they try to go tag the summit.
Right.
It'll take them like an hour and a half to put their shoes on because you're really bad at stuff. Yeah. And it just, your cognition just plummets.
I've heard this,
with the oxygen loss.
Even just covering that very short distance can be like surprisingly arduous.
Yeah,
is that because also of this stupidity thing?
Definitely, the stupidity thing has a big role, and also has a big role in bad decision making that goes on up high. But the key of it is that in that kind of altitude, you have about a third. You have only about, I think, 2/3 of the oxygen that you do at sea level.
Right.
And so that's why you get so stupid, is that there's no oxygen in your brain. And what else can happen is that you can get something called high altitude cerebral edema, which basically means your brain has swelling problems and is impeding on your skull, and you're being even dumber. Or having a coma, one of the two.
Surely the most extreme of sports. You have to contend with you becoming less risk averse, I suppose.
Right. And also the higher you go, the higher stakes your moves and decisions are. Like right. It's a rough sport, honestly.
Yeah, so it would lead to a bit of a macho culture, because
it is definitely,
because it's incredibly dumb to do this.
It's pretty, it's pretty dumb.
Nobody should do this. We should just make that clear. Nobody should do this.
Well, I don't know. It's the only way in a lot of these Sherpa villages to make money. So if they want to be if they want to work,
we're kind of encouraging eating the rich a little bit here.
A little bit
through this,
but and also like if a Sherpa, like if it wasn't for the Khumbu Icefall on the south side, there would not be very many Sherpa deaths on Mount Everest. And part of that is that it's literally like going to work, and so they don't make these really bad decisions, what they call summit fever, when people get close to the top and they're beyond their limit, yet they push on and keep going and then end up dying of exposure because they took too long and it's nighttime now. Typically, if it's just like going to your job, you're not going to make a dumb decision like that. You're just going to be like, welp, and then not do it.
I guess I'll go home.
Yeah.
So, it's a shame about the Khumbu Icefall, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and that's not the only place. Obviously, definitely there's avalanches and stuff that you can't avoid, and that definitely catches Sherpas and Westerners alike. But statistically, if it wasn't for the Khumbu on Everest, at least they have a pretty safe climbing record compared to Westerners, because they're not so dumb.
The Westerners have a point to make about man versus nature.
Yeah, definitely.
That's interesting psychological source material. It tells you about the role of routine in decision making a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, but it's also just like,
speaking of, I've fucked up in a very irregular way.
Yeah, you were too busy reflecting on.
I mean, you are going up a hill.
Yeah.
I would understand being nervous about that with this discussion.
So, who's the best mountain book?
Ooh, Into Thin Air is really good. I recommend that one.
How did he feel about having been a part of this?
He felt horrible. He gave some of his good friends died on this mountain on this trip, and he was leery of it anyway. John Krakauer had been mountaineering for a long time, and he had put up first ascents on certain routes in Alaska, like hard ones, climbed this really scary mountain called the Moose's Tooth there. And so he was a skilled mountaineer, but the culture of mountaineering is kind of a counterculture. It's like sort of like you probably have seen rock climbing dudes. They're a little bit like surfers, but they live in Colorado or whatever.
Right.
But so very, very counterculture-y, and the commercialization of the whole trip bothered him. But at the same time, he was like, well, this is the only opportunity I'll have to climb Mount Everest, and like, how do I say no to this? So he went along with reservations already, and then when all of the horrible stuff went down, he like sank into bad depression, and now when you hear him talk about it, you can tell he's still impacted.
So you think you're ever gonna climb a mountain, like a serious hard mountain?
No.
No.
No,
Probably a
Absolutely
good
not.
decision.
you can't have done all of this reading about it
Yeah.
and then decide yes.
But
Yeah.
people do, don't they? Like,
Yeah, they do. A lot of people actually get into mountaineering because they've read mountaineering books.
You're like, boy, that seems like a good time.
Well, and definitely,
I bet I'd do better than that.
that was an amazing story. I bet I could tell a pretty amazing story if I did
like,
this.
and it does, I could see it being interesting. Like, there's one that gets a lot of press about, like, oh, this was the first book that I read that really made me want to do it, and that was Morris Herzog's Annapurna, which is about the first French expedition that became the first people to climb Annapurna, which is the 9th highest mountain in the world. And the thing is, though, that the other people on that expedition later wrote books which were silenced by Herzog, and they were a lot less flattering. But when Herzog wrote it, it was a very like heroic, like machismo kind of.
It sounds like another Herzog I know.
A little bit, yeah. I don't think they're related, but they definitely have their similarities.
Wow. Death Mountain.
Yeah.
Good old Death Mountain. That was good. We're getting close to the end of our treks here. Do you want to wrap up with a particularly harrowing mountain anecdote?
Ooh. Okay, let me think. Okay, I have one. So, in the same disaster we've been talking about, the 1996 Mount Everest disaster, a few days after all of that had gone down, so at the end of May, I think it was like May 27th, there had been a South African team which had become shambles because the guy leading it, named Ian Woodall, was like a huge douche. And he was just like, all of the like experienced climbers quit. He wasn't even on a South African passport. He was a British dude just faking it so anyway, there was all that drama, but a woman named Kathy O'Dowd and a man named Bruce Harrod climbed at the end of May. And Ian Woodall and Kathy O'Dowd came down, but Bruce Harrod was slower and ended up probably, they later found his camera, but he must have summited, but late in the afternoon at like 4:30 or something, which is too late to be that high on the mountain because you have to have enough time to get back down to camp.
Right.
And what happened was that on his descent, there used to be, until last week, a thing on the south side of Mount Everest called the Hillary Step, which was like a 40-foot cliff that people had to climb down using like ropes. It was like technical rock climbing.
Right.
When the rest of it is just a drudging uphill slog. Just careful, but still. But recently that was demolished in an earthquake, they think. So the Hillary Step's gone now. But anyway, it had existed then. And apparently when Bruce Harrod was descending, he must have had trouble or gotten caught. There were a bunch of old ropes. It wasn't just one nice clean rope. There were like many of them dangling there. And he must have gotten caught and flipped over and ended up dying upside down, dangling due to exposure. But then a year later, an expedition with David Brashears, who I mentioned earlier, and a guy named Conrad Anker, who's super famous, were climbing Mount Everest for a documentary. I think it was the one that I mentioned, honestly, and ended up encountering him, and he was still dangling a year later, frozen. But they took his stuff from his pockets, got his camera, and then cut him loose.
This is about to say excellent.
Hey, yeah.
I made like no mistakes that it's going to count against me. Yeah.
Nice.
Good job.
A flawless trucks.
Man, extreme sports are a thing. Something that's been like kind of tangentially on my mind during this conversation is those wingsuit people who are like, let's fly at 100 miles an hour and see how close I can get to these giant rocks.
Oh yeah.
And like that's like the most high fatality rate of any extreme sport, I think, because they smack into the rocks sometimes.
Yeah, they would.
People have base jumped off of Mount Everest. You can't,
Oh my god.
can't keep a good man down, I guess.
I mean, it's like I I understand this impulse.
Yeah.
Like, I've done
To leap off of something that's really high up in the air.
just to do physically dangerous things
Okay.
that you think you
Okay.
can survive.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I also
There's a lot of
understand the impulse to jump off of things that are really high in the air for unrelated pharmacological reasons.
there's like some things to recommend it. Like imagine being the person who got away with it and can tell people.
Yeah.
Like
But it's also just like I am a relatively vague human being, at the best of times. But I tell you, I've scarcely felt so in the moment and current as when I've been climbing up a rock face that I really oughtn't to be climbing up, and I'm like, oh well, if I make a mistake, I'm gonna die.
Yeah.
Yeah. It does-
which I've done like 2 or 3 times in my life, and
Yeah.
it's just like, huh.
It does. There is a winnowing effect. You can't think of much else other than where you put your hand or your foot. When
Yeah,
you're going
and
up
like being
that.
present is such a gift. Like people tell you
Yeah.
that's the secret to happiness is
That's
like
true.
not being caught in the past or the future, but
Yeah.
like being in the moment.
So I
Unfortunately,
guess-
like rock climbing requires a hell of a lot of planning and logistics
Yeah,
on top of that for
ropes.
mountain climbing. So even that is a little bit odd, but I can understand at least the desire to use peril as a focusing element.
For sure.
okay, man. All right, I think that's about it.
And informative trucks. Thank you for being with us.
Welcome.
Good trucko, everybody.
Bye.